In 1960 and 61, I was a lieutenant in the U.S. Army based at Fort Dix, New Jersey. And on weekends when I could get away, I went to the Lower East Side of New York and hung out with artists, because by then I'd been hanging out with artists in San Francisco in 1959 and 60. John Brockman was part of that, a fellow named Steve Durkee, a poet named Gerd Stern. A group of artists and engineers called USCO was taking shape about then, standing for Us Company. And we had a resident engineer. It was the time of art and technology. There was pop art and highly visual op art. Stuff like this was a case where artists and scientists were paying attention to each other and seeing if there was fun things they could do together. And so it was, a brief shining moment where engineers, to some extent scientists, and younger artists really were having fun trying stuff together. Mm-hmm. Multimedia was part of that. That's the form that I started to do work in, first with a show called America Needs Indians, then later a show called War God. And multimedia then meant that you were using basically tape for sound, slides, film, 8mm, not even super 8mm, and live. And all of those going on simultaneously, either very well coordinated or some parts coordinated, some parts random, and then they would seem coordinated because of the way they fit together. Mm-hmm. I learned some of that from Charles Eames, who was doing designer company based in Los Angeles that was doing, by then, world's fairs and things like that. Most of their multimedia was brilliant slides in very large arrays and film, very good film, and very tightly programmed. The stuff I was doing was, the tape was programmed and everything else was playing off that, but playing it off in an improvisational way or random. The mechanism of meeting Ken Kesey was very straightforward. It was through Indians. By chance, I was a photojournalist then, and I got a job through a friend photographing Indians in Oregon at the Warm Springs Indian Reservation, because they were thinking of developing the reservation for tourists, and they wanted kind of a bunch of baseline images of what the reservation was really like with its wild horses and so on. And at that time, this is about 62, American Indians were not on anybody's map. Everybody thought basically they were dead. There was the kind of romantic image familiar in Germany of the noble Indians, and people would sometimes play Indians, and later hippies were using teepees and so on. But the presence of Indians in America then was basically non-existent. So I photographed these guys, and I thought, this is a real interesting, different America that I didn't know about, that is fundamental and profound. And then Kesey's book came out, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which had a character in it named Chief Broom. And Chief Broom was portrayed as an Indian from the reservation where I'd been working. So I was moved by that, and it sort of gave me the rest of the permission to think what I was thinking, that Indians were important. And so I sent Kesey photographs through a mutual friend. I knew his address that I'd taken, and he basically sent back a note, come on down. So I just showed up at Perry Lane near Stanford and at the door, and was met at the door by somebody with a joint of marijuana. Have some. And which was incredibly trusting at the time, because you were supposed to always smoke marijuana in the toilet and you'd be able to flush it at any moment. So this kind of welcome was normal for them, but not normal for most of the underworld. And I just was welcomed right in and blended in and became part of it. I was a fringe prankster. I was more conservative than most. I did less drugs than most. I was on the bus from time to time. Being on the bus, going from acid test to acid test, basically, which was Kesey's form of performance art, using our band was group called the Warlocks, which later became the Grateful Dead. A number of people around the group were ex-Army, like I was. A number of them were artists. And it was intensely improvisational. Kesey by then had written his second and best book called Sometimes a Great Notion, and was, in his mind, basically saying goodbye to writing novels. He wanted to live a novel. And the bus was Kesey's attempt at providing a very good attempt at providing a plot line that we would then all be characters in this story. Was it a moving laboratory? Yes. In Kesey's mind, it was a moving laboratory. He said, these scientists talk about doing research, and that's really all they're doing is research. We're doing search. And if we don't boil rocks and drink the water, how do we know it won't make us drunk? And what we do is boil rocks. In other words, try any damn thing. And some of them were pretty interesting experiments. One, for example, would be take a whole bunch of people sitting around basically stoned, 15 people. Take a bunch of garden hose and cut it up into 8 or 10 foot lengths, tie it all together in a knot, grab two pieces, talk into one and listen to the other. And everybody's doing this. And so you know who you're hearing, but you don't know who you're talking to. And this is happening in a group of 15 people, just to see what happens. That was search. The Whole Earth Catalog project certainly had all of that frame of reference, but it specifically came out of an LSD afternoon where I was on a rooftop with probably 200 micrograms of LSD in me, nothing better to do, and thinking about, or in context of lectures I had recently heard by Buckminster Fuller, and Fuller, like McLuhan, was one of the people we were paying attention to then. And I was 2 stories up physically and considerably higher than that chemically, and looking at the downtown San Francisco. I had an apartment in North Beach, and I thought I could see the buildings of downtown San Francisco not being parallel, but diverging slightly because they're on a curved Earth surface. And then I thought, well, if I go up further, that would be even more obvious, and further still it'd be more obvious. You get far enough, and it closes, and you have a realization that the Earth is finite and an island. And at that point, Buckminster Fuller was saying everybody thinks the Earth really is flat and infinite, and that we can use up stuff because there's an infinite amount of resources out there, but it's not true. It's an island. And so the whole Earth became the frame of reference for me. This is in the spring of 1966. And by the fall of 67, spring of 68, when I was working on a catalog, one day the guy who sort of held an umbrella over my weird project, Dick Raymond, came in and said, "What are you calling this thing?" And I said, "I don't know, Whole Earth Catalog or something." And just picking up on this sort of mission that I was still on to get photographs of the Earth from space, which did not yet exist in 68. And hence Whole Earth Catalog. So it was a byproduct of Buckminster Fuller and of LSD. The catalog was devised on an airplane flying back in 1967 from burying my father, who just died at the age of 64. And he and my mother had been investing money in my name for many years, which I had ignored, and I thought, well, maybe now's the time I should start actually thinking about what to do with that money. I had no idea how much it was. And I thought, I'll do something for the communes that I knew by then were scattered all over, and I had friends in them, and I also knew that they were struggling. They're trying to plant gardens and didn't know how to do that, and they're trying to build buildings, didn't know how to do that. And all of us were the product of good liberal educations. We didn't know how to do anything. So I scribbled out on the plane, actually in the back of a book by Barbara Ward called Spaceship Earth, the basic outline for the catalog, and started on it the next day. The initial audience in my mind was communes. It was people who were trying to reinvent civilization, and I was just trying to provide the tools with which to reinvent civilization. And Turned out a lot of people were interested in that. The communes that try to, quote, go back to basics and just farm, made a real good try at doing that. And some of them even learned a fair amount of serious farming. A book that we purveyed in the Whole Earth Catalog called Goat Husbandry was a very popular book. And it's a good book. You get the book, get a goat, you can do it. Milk and everything. But it didn't play out very far. It was basically a different kind of dead end from what drugs were. Whereas some of the technology, some of the alternative energy technology showed real promise. Solar energy basically took off gradually and takes off to this day. Computer technology, obviously. And because the counterculture hippie frame of reference was there for outlaws of all kinds, it basically swept right through the outlaw computer people, hackers, and became their frame of reference in a kind of a gift economy optimistic approach, became then the basis for personal computer software, then the internet and the web, and on and on. And that's the main legacy from the 60s, as far as I'm concerned, is the open system approach to everything having to do with computers.
When did you see, a very easy question, when did you see your first computer and where was it?
The incident that got me going, I actually photographed the two men who developed the ENIAC computer when I was a photographer for the Army, Prosper Eckert, and I forget the other guy. And but the first time I saw computers doing something extremely strange was in about 61 or 62 at Stanford. I was, for some reason, being shown around the computation center, and there were people in the back room, programmers, playing a game called Space War. I'm actually giving a talk next week, on the effect that Space War had on everything. But what I saw was typical psychedelic behavior. Young people mashing buttons, looking at this then very crude visual display out of their bodies, and intensely engaged in combat, in a game, in conflict, and having the time of their lives. And you look at it and you just wanted to play, to do something. So that was the first time I saw computers as something other than boring tools of accounting. And there in the Mid-Peninsula, we had hackers all around us. Some were working in our office. These companies were very open, like a Hewlett-Packard, and we're right there. Doug Engelbart was doing his work right across the street at the Stanford Research Institute, SRI. That became involved in 1969 in his demo, which showed the mouse and all these other things. So by chance, the Whole Earth Catalog was in Silicon Valley before it was called Silicon Valley, and we turned out to be part of that uprising.
Cybernetics, was this for the West Coast an important thing?
Intellectual framework for what was being attempted here. The New Left had a whole huge intellectual framework that I know nothing of and could care less. The artists were aware of McLuhan. The medium is the message. Happenings, which had been an East Coast art form, sort of pooped out pretty quickly out here. Psychedelic art, graphic art took off here. It took off about 2 inches. It was not all that wonderful. The music was pretty good. Intellectual frame of reference, I mean, I had some that I was working with, but most did not.
Mm-hmm. There
was spiritual stuff. I mean, people were reading the Book of the Dead, both the Egyptian one and the Tibetan one. They were aware of Aldous Huxley and Alan Watts, and sort of some of the beatnik, certainly the beat poets who were still in the thick of all this, Gary Snyder and Allen Ginsberg and so on, Michael McClure. But Kenneth Rexroth by then was, the people who had taught the beatniks were pretty much not part of the scene now. The beatniks still were. And so for hippies, it was all pretty secondhand. They were not doing that much of their own thinking. Gregory Bateson used to frown at this. He was at Santa Cruz by then teaching some of these kids, and he said they've got the idea that thinking is bad, because they've discovered that some thinking is indeed bad, but it didn't occur to them that it's bad thinking that's bad, not. So he made a category mistake.
But Gregory Bateson, he taught this charts of the hippies?
He was teaching at Santa Cruz in the 60s and 70s, University of California, Santa Cruz, and also at Esalen Institute. Esalen Institute was probably as much of an intellectual framework as any out here. You okay?
No.
Excuse me just 1 second.
What we had as an intellectual framework for a lot of this was coalesced at Esalen Institute as much as anywhere. And so you would see spiritual teachers, you would see anthropologists like Mike Harner from the University of California, who had been working with Jibaro Indians and doing drugs like Banisteriopsis and things like this. Esalen at that point could get almost any leading thinker because it was brand new. It started about in the mid-60s. And to get an idea of what was going on intellectually, just reading the catalog of Esalen Institute was often a good way to do that. People who started Esalen, Dick Price and Michael Murphy, had both been taught by a religion teacher at Stanford, same one I had, named Frederick Spiegelberg. And they then went to India, hung out with Sri Aurobindo, got kind of that frame of reference. Many others here, Zen Buddhism was really taking off initially through the hippies who inspired Dick Baker, and the San Francisco Zen Center was cranking up by the late 60s and then right through the 70s in a very strong way. And Gregory Bateson, who basically came to California from Hawaii in the late 60s, then was a really solid frame of reference for many of us, especially me, right through the 1970s. And books like Steps to an Ecology of Mind, Mind and Nature, things like this, became the way that cybernetic thinking, systems thinking, found its way to many of us. I'd been aware of and paying close attention to Norbert Wiener and the Macy conferences and all of that some while before, but most people did not. I still think it's the core of much of the sort of work that we do now at Santa Fe Institute, complexity theory and so on, and has held up very well. And a number of, especially European scientists like James Lovelock, the Gaia hypothesis guy, are completely cybernetic in their thinking. Right.
And
Laws of Form, we actually had G. Spencer Brown at Esalen. Nobody could understand the thing he said, and we came to the conclusion he was probably verging on insane. those names. God. And look at these names. Gregory Bateson, Carl Pribram, the hologram theory of the brain, Dick Albert Ramdas, Claudio Naranjo, Heinz von Förster, Charles Tart, Liz Kelly, Ted Kuhn, me, Kurt von Meyer, Carlos Castaneda. We were not as critical as we should have been.
But the conference was held around this book, Law by Form.
Laws of Form, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you were one of the
organizers? Oh, absolutely. I thought the book was brilliant, and there are many who still believe that. I mean, what a great first line. Draw a distinction. Call it the first distinction. And then to build a whole mathematics and basically a whole worldview on that. That's good stuff. And it worked enough. I wish that G. Spencer Brown hadn't been loony, because the second and third books might have then, done things with application and all the rest of it, but they didn't. They didn't exist. He was a dead end, by and large.
And why?
I think it's personality. I think that G. Spencer Brown was an impacted genius, like an impacted tooth. It just grows in on itself. And was able to emit this one amazing book, but not connect enough with the world to go anywhere with it. Well, there's Esalen, there's hot springs, and you go and get in hot springs, and it's not customary to wear bathing suits in the hot springs, so. But we weren't naked in the sessions. Early on, we had some dingbat people there. Lilly, the dolphin guy, who by then was heading down a long dingbat path, was there holding forth that this was very important, sort of thing. Well, okay, Lilly thinks it's important, maybe it is. Gregory Bateson was around. He was persuaded that there was potentially something there. It's basically a notation system based on primary distinctions, I understand it. And it looked a lot like programming, which we understood was important. None of us were programmers. So we were waiting to see, will the computer guys take this and run with it? And a few computer guys years later, did try to take it, and they couldn't very successfully run anywhere with it. So is it a philosophical, spiritual frame of reference, which might be useful? Another guy named Brown did a book called Love's Body. Everybody paid attention to that for a couple of months. And he came out to Esalen, and we heard his story. And that also turned out to be a one-off. Carlos Castaneda, unfortunately, should have been a one-off. His first two books were pretty interesting, and then the rest were just derivative fiction. Mm-hmm. But he was able to sustain a readership, but he lost the critically discerning pretty quickly. Whereas someone like, as I was saying, Christopher Alexander with a book called Pattern Language, and an earlier book called Notes on the Synthesis of Form, which very much like G. Spencer Brown is a completely general purpose, very theoretical view on how design happens and should happen. That book is still in print. Chris Alexander has enormously influenced thousands of people, not just building designers, software designers, mm-hmm. people across the board, and certainly me. And but at the beginning, you could not tell a Chris Alexander from a G. Spencer Brown, so you give them as good a shot as you can to hear them out and see if you can use this stuff. And it's not like terrible rejection or our elite frowns on G. Spencer Brown or something like that. It was nothing that organized. It was just sort of, well, who else you got? Maybe he'll do something later. And you hope for the best and thank him very much for coming. But it's pretty pragmatic, Darwinian, non-academic, whose ideas prove useful as tools, not do they represent the right spectrum from the political or academic or framework. Late 60s, part of Portola Institute was a grassroots movement to teach programming to everybody, teach basically to everybody. And so we saw and were part of a takeover of centralized computing from the start. And that was the main perspective we got on computing, was that this was not centralized control at all. It was decentralized control. It was user takes control. And then that rapidly became, with personal computer and then later with the internet, basically the means to a revolution. Very similar, in my mind, a very cybernetic revolution, similar to what the founding fathers who rebelled against Britain and then wrote the U.S. Constitution, which is this astoundingly cybernetic document. These were a set of revolutionaries who succeeded, and not once but twice. They succeeded once with personal computers, and then many of the same people were involved in the second success with the internet. Big Blue, which stood for IBM, which stood for mainframe computing, which stood for centralized control, was seen as the enemy. And kind of the way Microsoft is now. And that they should be taken down technologically, they should be taken down commercially, they should be taken down aesthetically, and they were. And the reason IBM is surviving now is because they bought into the revolution that was aimed initially against them. So they now sell open source software like Linux ahead of their competition. Places like Stanford Artificial Intelligence Lab, to a lesser degree Xerox PARC, were open to young programmers, hackers, many of them, not all of them. And the elder generation of rather well-dressed software engineers were quite welcoming to the kids, who would step right up to programming skills very quickly, and in the colleges often knew more than their professors for a while there in the 60s, maybe into the 70s. And they were generous. They had the hippie ethic of generosity, and gift economy, and information ought to be free, and so you would do some programming improvements and then just hand it over, the stuff that's in Stephen Levy's Hackers book. And that was not resisted by the computer establishment, at least in academia, because they were good programmers. They were coming out, they were inventing cool stuff, cool not just in terms of games, but cool in terms of word processing and a lot of other stuff that became commercial tools. And it was a subversion which became intentional pretty quickly, but never covert at all, or in any sense diabolical. It was just a liberation done by permission of nearly everybody. At each stage there would be resistance. No, you can't, you must copy protect all software because otherwise people would steal it. And then they realized that when you did that, the user could not back up their own systems, which crashed all of the time, and so the users would go to another vendor who did not copy protect. But the political stance taken by the hackers was, don't get in our way. We will create a world that you can sell whatever you want to sell in. And we kept being right about that. Generally, as near as I can tell, at that time, ARPA was seen as pretty much a force for good. It was not DARPA, it was not Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, it was Advanced Research Projects Agency. And the information for what was it, Department of Information and Processing Technology or something like that, was mainly feeding money to places like MIT for Project Mac, probably Stanford AI, and they were very much developing computer technology across the board, with or without defense applications. And it was seen as basically civilian-oriented research. The ARPANET was set up as a collaboration among a number of civilian computation centers with the idea that they would share computational resources, which is just now being attempted with something called GridNet and may well be successful. At that time, it was not particularly. What they wound up doing was inventing email, or basically giving a place where email could take off, and then email took over the world and rules to this day. ARPANET was, when I first saw it at Xerox PARC, was intensely civilian. There was no sense of, oh, this is something coming from the dread defense establishment. It was more like hot dog free money to do what we want to do. I mean, I took my last LSD in 1969, and so I quit before lots of people started. I think what we refer to as the 60s carried on through at least half of the 70s and maybe most of the 70s. By then, the frame of reference is pretty much played out. Everything feels like it's aftermarket. It's after the parade's gone by. The kids want to do something else. They want to do punk. They want to do something which is not that. And the ones who are clinging to 60s stuff, and Ken Kesey, I fear, was one, by and large became either caricatures of themselves in sort of sad cases, or very much typecast and into a minor role. Other stuff was picking up by then. I think by then the computer frame of reference, which had escaped from being counterculture, was taking off as the more interesting stuff that was happening. And so it became a computer age instead of a counterculture age. That the creative folks that I knew were seeing as the place where you bore a relation to what was going on. It's hard to be a counterculture when it is now the culture. So some of that was, I don't know if it was a closed system, but they blurred into each other in a serious way. Well, this is what happens when you have success as a resistance of any kind. Once the resistance wins, it's no longer the resistance, it's the system. So that was part of the dynamic that played out. Whether it's closed or not, I'm not inclined to say. They were about each other, and then they became each other. But there was lots more going on. If that was the only thing going on, then that would have been that, but it wasn't.